Fort Ancient is a 2,000-year-old masterpiece of geometry and endurance. Built by the indigenous peoples of Ohio, it is a 3.5-mile-long perimeter of earth and stone that incredibly reaches 20 feet high in some parts. It is one of the most complex and monumental earthwork landscapes in North America, and was very likely intentionally aligned to the movements of the sun and the moon. To understand Fort Ancient more fully, we must follow the people who shaped this landscape, and the reasons, practical, ceremonial, and cosmic, that may have guided their hands. From the arrival of the first indigenous architects to the modern-day recognition of this site as one of the most important places on Earth, we will walk through its history chronologically and in detail. Our story begins not with walls or ditches, but with the land itself. The Fort Ancient site sits atop a natural promontory formed by glacial and river erosion. Steep ravines cut deeply into the plateau, creating natural barriers on three sides. Below flows the Little Miami River, a vital transportation route and ecological resource for thousands of years. This location was not chosen by accident. Archaeological evidence suggests that indigenous groups occupied the surrounding region as early as 10,000 BC, during the Paleo-Indian period. These early inhabitants were mobile hunter-gatherers who followed seasonal resources, leaving behind stone tools but no permanent architecture. Over millennia, as the climate stabilized and ecosystems diversified, societies became more sedentary. By the Archaic period, people were returning repeatedly to favored places like this plateau. The land was already meaningful, long before the first shovel of earth was moved. The earliest large-scale modifications of the Fort Ancient landscape are associated with the Adena culture, beginning around 800 BC. The Adena were the first societies in eastern North America to build monumental earthworks. They constructed conical burial mounds, circular enclosures, and ceremonial spaces that required coordinated labor and shared belief systems. At Fort Ancient, archaeological evidence indicates that some of the earliest earthworks may date to this Adena period, though the site we see today is largely the result of later construction. Adena presence is suggested by burial mounds in the surrounding region and early soil layers beneath later walls. What the Adena contributed most significantly was not scale, but tradition, the idea that Earth itself could be shaped into sacred architecture. The most dramatic chapter in Fort Ancient's construction begins with the Hopewell culture, a widespread interaction network that flourished across the Ohio River Valley. The Hopewell were not a single tribe, but a constellation of communities connected through trade, ritual, and shared cosmology. They exchanged obsidian from the Rocky Mountains, copper from the Great Lakes, mica from the Appalachians, and marine shells from the Gulf Coast. They also built many earthworks throughout the region. However, Fort Ancient during this period became something extraordinary. Over centuries, the Hopewell people constructed more than 18,000 feet, over 3.5 miles of earthen walls, enclosing approximately 126 acres. These walls vary in height from 3 to over 20 feet, following the natural contours of the land, rather than forming a simple geometric shape. The Hopewell culture moved over 550,000 cubic yards of earth to build the earthworks. They didn't have wheels or metal tools. Every pound of soil was carried in woven baskets. If one looks closely at the walls today, archaeologists can still see the individual basket loads, distinct clumps of different colored clays stacked like bricks. The ravines cutting through the site were not obstacles to overcome. They were incorporated. Instead of straightening the walls, builders dipped them into the ravines and then brought them back up the opposite side. The construction was built in 3 distinct sections: the North Fort, the Middle Fort, and the South Fort. But they weren't building walls to keep enemies out. We know this because there are over 60 gaps or gateways in the walls. Forts do not contain 60 doorways. Instead, these gaps were ceremonial markers. Many of these gateways are narrow, indirect, or paired. The construction techniques were both simple and sophisticated. Earth was moved using baskets, antler tools, and wooden implements. Soil analysis shows that different layers of clay, gravel, and topsoil were deliberately selected and stacked, suggesting not just labor, but planning and knowledge of materials. The walls were not built all at once. Radiocarbon dating and stratigraphy indicate multiple construction phases, sometimes centuries apart. Walls were heightened, reshaped, and occasionally buried beneath later expansions. This was a living landscape, constantly renewed. Some gateways align with natural ridgelines or river approaches. Others appear to frame specific sightlines across the interior of the enclosure. Many are offset or curved, forcing anyone entering to slow down and turn, an action that may have held ritual significance. Rather than defending against enemies, these gateways may have structured movement, procession, and experience. Entering Fort Ancient may have been a deliberate ceremonial act rather than a practical one. Within the enclosure, the land is not empty. Archaeological surveys and soil studies have identified natural depressions and water-retaining basins, some of which were likely enhanced or maintained by human activity. These interior ponds would have held water seasonally and may have been symbolically important. Water, in many indigenous cosmologies, represents boundaries between worlds, life and death, earth and sky, present and ancestral time. The combination of earth walls and interior water features suggests a carefully balanced ceremonial landscape where natural elements were integrated into human design. The ceremonial thresholds, often lined with massive limestone pavements, were used for ritual dancing or processions. The Hopewell chose the site for its proximity to the sky and the water. But perhaps the most debated and fascinating aspect of Fort Ancient is its possible relationship to the lunar cycle. Some researchers have proposed that certain gateways and wall alignments correspond to the major lunar standstill, a phenomenon that occurs every 18.6 years, when the moon reaches its northernmost and southernmost rising and setting points on the horizon. At Fort Ancient, specific mounds and gateways are aligned to these lunar extremes. In the North Fort, 4 stone-covered mounds form a near-perfect square, serving as a ceremonial calculator. By sighting through the gaps in the embankment walls from these mounds, the Hopewell could predict the exact day the moon would reach its lunar standstill. In 2024 and 2025, modern observers gathered at these very spots to witness these alignments, proving the mathematical precision of these ancient architects. At Fort Ancient, several gateways appear to align with these extreme lunar positions when viewed from specific interior locations. It is important to be precise here. Not all archaeologists agree on the intentionality of these alignments. However, the repeated appearance of lunar-aligned earthworks across the Hopewell world strengthens the argument that celestial observation played a role in site planning. Tracking the moon requires long-term knowledge passed down across generations. If Fort Ancient was designed, even in part, around the lunar cycle, it suggests a deep temporal awareness, one that links human ritual to cosmic rhythm. The Fort Ancient earthworks possess sightlines to other river valleys and travel routes connecting to the other Hopewell earthwork sites. Many of these sites are spaced out a day's journey on foot. Hopewell people may have treated Fort Ancient like a pilgrimage site, a seasonal gathering node, or a boundary marker between cosmological regions. Archaeologists are confident that no one actually lived in or around the Fort Ancient site, as it contains very few signs of human habitation, such as hearths or trash middens. However, many hypothesize that certain individuals or lineages of Hopewell people held ritual authority over the site, whereby they lived in nearby settlements. If the intentionality of the alignments are indeed true, by 200 AD, Fort Ancient had essentially become a massive astronomical clock, as specific gateways seem to be designed around the summer or winter solstice, as the sun rises and sets perfectly within these gateways. The Hopewell were tracking the cosmos, They were aligning their lives on Earth with the movement of the stars. In the center of the North Fort, they constructed what we now call the Moorhead Circle, a 200-foot diameter woodhenge made of roughly 200 massive wooden posts arranged concentrically. In 2005, the Morehead Circle was discovered through remote testing. The woodhenge was the heartbeat of the site, a place for ritual, dance, and gathering that lasted for centuries. Within this circle, archaeologists found a central rectangular pit filled with bright red, burned soil brought from elsewhere, likely a sacred altar. Surrounding this were shallow trenches that may have served as ritual ponds or drains. The Hopewell used these to manage water flow, possibly reflecting the sky and the still water during ceremonies. They weren't just utility ditches, they were part of a ceremonial machine designed to manage the spiritual power of the site. The idea that Fort Ancient's earthworks are aligned with celestial bodies is a serious topic of archaeological study, but it needs to be explained carefully because the evidence is suggestive rather than absolute, and different alignments have different levels of confidence. There is incredible evidence that some gateways and sightlines at Fort Ancient align with celestial events, including the solar and lunar risings and settings. However, not all researchers agree on intentional precision, and the alignments appear to be ritual and symbolic, not practical or defensive. Several researchers, including archaeoastronomers studying Hopewell sites, have documented that certain gateways at Fort Ancient align closely with the sunrise or sunset. Some alignments correspond to the summer solstice sunrise, the winter solstice sunset, and the equinox sunrise or sunset. In particular, one well-known gateway on the eastern side of the enclosure frames the rising sun when viewed from a specific interior vantage point. When photographed at the correct time of the year, the sun appears to rise directly within the opening. This effect is not visible every day. It occurs only within a narrow window of days around the solar event, which argues against pure coincidence. While solar alignments are impressive, many scholars believe the lunar cycle may have been even more important at Fort Ancient. Tracking this cycle requires long-term observation and intergenerational knowledge. At Fort Ancient, some gateways align with the maximum northern or southern moon rises, and these alignments only occurred during the standstill years, making them extraordinarily specific. Similar lunar alignments appear at other Hopewell sites, including Newark Earthworks. Because these alignments repeat so rarely, many archaeologists consider them strong evidence of intentional design, even if the exact meanings remain unknown. Fort Ancient was likely not a scientific observatory, used nightly to track the sky. Instead, it functioned more as a ceremonial calendar, a place where cosmic cycles were made visible, and a landscape that connected human time to celestial time. However, some archaeologists remain cautious because erosion and later modification may have shifted alignments, and with so many gateways, some alignments could have occurred by chance. Inside the enclosure are subtle rises, not dramatic mounds, but gentle elevations. Archaeologists believe some of these were intentionally cleared to offer clear views to specific gateways or horizon points. These may have served as ritual viewing stations, where a small number of people observed celestial events, while others gathered below. If this was indeed the case, then it would indicate social complexity of the peoples using the earthworks. Though the site today looks very green, with green grass everywhere, as seen in the images shown throughout this documentary, at the site's zenith, the earthworks were earthen-colored, not green. They were a colorful mixture of reddish-brown, yellowish clay, and gray-brown subsoil with small patches of vegetation. From a distance, the walls would have looked raw, alive, and recently touched, not park-like. Despite its scale, Fort Ancient was likely not a permanent residential settlement. Excavations have revealed relatively few domestic structures and limited evidence of everyday food preparation. Instead, the site appears to have been a gathering place, used periodically for ceremonies, feasts, exchanges, and rites of passage. People may have traveled from across the region to assemble at Fort Ancient, bringing offerings, stories, and shared traditions. In this sense, Fort Ancient was less a city and more a sacred landscape, activated at certain times, then left quiet again. Around 500 AD, Hopewell societies across the Ohio Valley began to change. Trade networks diminished. Monument construction slowed. By approximately 1000 AD, Fort Ancient was largely abandoned. There is no evidence of violent destruction, no mass graves, no signs of siege or catastrophe. Instead, what we see is ritual closure. Some walls were deliberately left unfinished. Certain gateways appeared to have been intentionally blocked or altered. Activity gradually ceased, rather than ending abruptly. This pattern suggests that Fort Ancient was not simply deserted, but formally decommissioned, its role in the cultural world completed. There is no evidence of emergency repair, defensive reinforcement, or hasty abandonment. Instead, walls slowly weathered, gateways filled naturally, and activity tapered off. This aligns with indigenous traditions of ritual abandonment, where places are not destroyed, but allowed to return to the earth once their purpose is complete. The end of the Hopewell era at Fort Ancient wasn't a sudden flight or a conquest. It was a controlled, ritualistic closing. The Hopewell peoples pulled up the massive wooden posts and filled the holes with stones. They then hauled tons of gravel up the 245-foot cliffs from the riverbed to seal the entire ceremonial area beneath a thick layer of stone. Lead archaeologists compare this to the decommissioning of a nuclear reactor. The Hopewell peoples believed the ritual power of the site was so intense that it had to be buried to protect future generations. After this massive final effort, the site was abandoned to the forest for nearly 500 years. Why this happened remains uncertain. Climate shifts, social reorganization, and changes in belief systems all likely played a role. What is clear, though, is that the site's abandonment was not a failure, but a transformation. At around 900 AD, a new group of people moved in. These people were farmers. They grew corn, beans, and squash. Because they lived among these ancient walls, early 19th century archaeologists named them the Fort Ancient culture. This is the great historical irony. The Fort Ancient people did not build the walls of Fort Ancient. They were essentially squatters on a much older, much more grand landscape. They built a village within the South Fort, living their lives in the shadows of the monuments that were already 500 years old when they arrived. By the time Europeans arrived, the builders' identities had faded into ancestral memory, but the site itself endured. For indigenous peoples, the land remained meaningful, even as its original purpose became part of a deeper, older past. Fast forward to the late 1700s, European settlers began moving into the Ohio Valley. When they climbed the bluffs of the Little Miami, they were stunned. They saw massive embankments, 20 feet high in some places, overgrown with ancient oaks. Because the settlers were living in a time of frontier warfare, they assumed these were military fortifications. In 1809, the name Fort Ancient appeared in maps and journals. In 1843, a doctor named John Locke conducted the first professional survey, mapping the site with incredible accuracy. He was the first to suggest that this wasn't a fort at all, but something much more sacred. By the late 1800s, many of Ohio's mounds were being leveled by farmers' plows. Fort Ancient was in danger. In 1891, thanks to the tireless work of archaeologist Warren K. Moorhead, the Ohio legislature purchased the land. It became Ohio's very first state park. This was a turning point. Instead of being farmed into oblivion, the walls were stabilized. The museum began to take shape, and for the first time, the public began to understand that the Indians the settlers had fought were the descendants of a highly sophisticated, peaceful, and scientific civilization. Today, Fort Ancient stands as the largest hilltop enclosure in North America. Its walls still follow the ancient contours of the land. Its gateways still open onto the sky and river. The moon still rises and sets beyond its embankments, just as it did centuries ago. Fort Ancient reminds us that history is not only written, it is shaped, carried, and remembered in Earth. It is a record of time measured not in years, but in cycles, of moon and season, gathering and departure, and construction and release. And in its quiet abandonment, Fort Ancient leaves us with a powerful truth, that some of the greatest human achievements were never meant to last forever, only to matter while they were needed. The most recent chapter of our story is perhaps the most important. For decades, historians campaigned to have these earthworks recognized on the global stage. In September 2023, the dream was realized. UNESCO officially designated Fort Ancient, along with other Hopewell sites, as a World Heritage Site. This put these Ohio earthworks in the same category as the Great Pyramids of Giza, Stonehenge, and the Great Wall of China. As we stand here in 2026, the site is no longer just a local park. It is a protected monument of human history. Recent LIDAR and remote sensing technology continue to reveal new features beneath the soil. Hidden timber circles and ritual pavements that haven't seen the light of day in 1,500 years. When you visit Fort Ancient today, you aren't just looking at piles of dirt. You are looking at the fingerprints of a people who understood the stars, who valued communal labor, and who respected the geography of the Little Miami Valley. The Hopewell are gone, and the Fort Ancient farmers who followed them are gone, but their architecture remains. It is a bridge between the deep past and our modern world, a reminder that in the heart of Ohio, a great civilization once reached for the stars. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed my documentary, don't forget to like and subscribe, and check out my Patreon page at patreon.com/World Chronicles.